Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy Szafron. This is Kitco News. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our latest updates. Well, today we're taking a close look at what's really going on with the U.S. economy. On the surface, things might look pretty good. GDP just got a bump up to 3% and consumer spending is up 2%, which usually means people are feeling pretty confident. Unemployment still sitting at around 4.3%. But here's where things get tricky. A lot of the GDP growth is coming from government spending, and our national debt has skyrocketed to over $35.2 trillion in the last quarter of 2023. That amount crossed a monumental threshold of $1 trillion every 3 months, and it only gets higher. Now, inflation is still above the Fed's target of 2%. This has made everything more expensive, and while people are spending, they're also piling on debt. Consumer debt has hit a record of $17.8 trillion. On top of that, more people are starting to fall behind on their credit card payments, which isn't a very good sign. And then there's the job market. The government just revised job growth numbers down by over 800,000 jobs from the past year, which makes you wonder, are things really getting better? Are we getting the full picture here? Well, to help us sort through all of this, we've got Antoni with us today. He's a public finance economist with the Heritage Foundation and a senior fellow at Unleash Prosperity. Hey, EJ, welcome to Kitco News. Thanks for coming on with us today.
Jeremy, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, you heard that intro. We got so much to get into. I've been reading some of your commentary. I've been so interested, and I think the audience will too. But talk to me about this Q2 GDP number, up 3%. Is this growth really sustainable, or are we just borrowing from the future to make today's numbers look good?
Borrowing from the future, I think, is the best way to put it, Jeremy. And, part of the disparity between GDP and GDI, which theoretically should be equivalent, right? They're essentially on either side of an equal sign. You have the income component and you have the spending component. But the problem is that has been those two or that mathematical identity, I should say, those two categories have essentially been divorced from one another in large part because of what you just mentioned, this dragging forward of growth from the future to today through the mechanism of debt. That has been done through the two types of debt that you mentioned earlier, one of which is government debt, this explosion in the federal debt, but also in a huge increase in consumer debt as well. And you mentioned the fact that credit cards, for example, we're seeing the loan non-performance on those accounts go through the roof right now. A big reason for that is the fact that interest rates right now are near an all-time high, while the actual amount of credit card debt outstanding is at a record high. And those two have combined to create a situation where for the first time ever, the American consumer is paying over $300 billion annually just in interest on their credit cards. In other words, they are tapped out. They don't have enough money even to make their minimum payments at this point. And that's where you're getting to see a lot of that loan non-performance. And it's going to drag down consumer spending in the future.
Okay, so consumer spending also jumped by 2.9%, which some, of course, say shows resilience. But to your point, are Americans just running their credit card through the roof here? Have they burnt through their savings? We keep hearing about all this stimulus. Is that gone?
Well, Jeremy, part of the problem here when we look at these aggregate level data is the fact that we're missing who has the savings. The only groups really that have savings left, again, as a group, would be the very, very wealthy. So you're looking at that upper echelon of income earners, the top 10% or so. They're the only ones who really have savings left as a group. If you look at lower income groups, lower income deciles, for example, they all are negative net savers. In other words, they are going into debt month after month. They are diminishing their savings if they even have any savings left. All of the pre-pandemic savings for the bottom 90% are gone. And as well, those bottom 90% also have less pre-pandemic savings than they did in 2019. So all around, it's a very, very difficult situation for those folks. Their income growth has not kept up with inflation since the beginning of 2021, when those inflation numbers really kicked into high gear.
Mm-hmm. I was reading your latest analysis, and you've said that today's inflation is largely driven by runaway government spending, which we've seen. And then, of course, we have the Fed money printing. With inflation still hovering around 3%, what's the right move to bring prices down without crashing the economy?
The right move needs to be a conjunction of both reducing government spending, but also the Fed reducing growth in the money supply. And if you just do one or the other, that's where you're going to get the most friction in the economy. That's where you're going to get the most pain. This was a key reason why, for example, in the early 1980s, we had to have those terrible back-to-back recessions, the worst economic downturn since the Great Recession, or Great Depression, up until that time, because we did not get the reduction in government spending that we needed to go along with the Fed tightening monetary policy. Now, what really got us out of that slump was all of the pro-growth policies put in place during the Reagan years. And that was not just Republicans, by the way. That was Reagan working with Democrats who controlled Congress for most of that time. And putting those pro-growth policies in place allowed the economy to grow relative to the size of the debt load, specifically relative to the size of the cost of servicing the debt. It's very similar, Jeremy, to a household budget where if you want to afford a bigger home and you can't get the actual price of the home down, you either need to look for a lower interest rate or you need to increase your household income or do both. And during the 80s, we effectively did both.
Okay, so I mean, with the U.S. running on that record debt, $35.2 trillion, I mean, it's a huge load here. What should the top priorities? I mean, you mentioned a couple of them there, but how do we avoid this long-term economic damage from this debt?
Jeremy, very, very good question. Unfortunately, there's a lot of damage, I think, looking forward to next year that at this point is already just baked into the cake. We have pulled so much growth forward from the future that at some point that bill comes due. Now, again, there are plenty of steps you can take to minimize the damage, but you're not going to be able to escape all of it. There's just no way. And again, going back to something we started the conversation with, that discrepancy between GDP and GDI, I think is a very good illustration of this point. GDI is not going to completely catch up to GDP. So GDP in part is going to have to catch down. And unfortunately, that's probably what we have to look forward to, at least in the near term. Now, going back to your question in the long term, again, if you put the pro-growth policies back in place that we had previously, that we had, basically from 2018 to 2020, that would solve a lot of our problems. We've done it before. We can do it again.
Yeah, no, good point. And we will get into some of that direction because obviously with the upcoming election, there's a lot of eyeballs on what these policymakers plan on doing. Before we do that, I got to ask you about these jobs. EJ, we keep getting these revisions. I mean, the BLS just revised jobs down to 818,000 from the past year. That's the biggest adjustment since the recession. What do you say? What does this say about real estate, our job market? Can we trust the data coming out of Washington?
No, Jeremy, unfortunately, we can't. And, let's be perfectly clear. There's no evidence, there's no smoking gun, so to speak. There's no evidence of intentional manipulation of the numbers at BLS. I actually know some BLS folks, and there really doesn't seem to be anything nefarious going on. In terms of a sin of commission, in terms of a sin of omission, that's very different. There does seem to be, let's say, an issue there. What I mean is that the problems in these statistics were clearly evident beginning in the spring of 2022. And so far, the BLS has done precisely nothing to solve those problems. In other words, if people from the outside, those of us who are not part of BLS, have been able to identify these issues, you sure as heck better believe that the folks inside the BLS knew that they were going on. And I think the scandal is the fact that nothing so far has been done to correct those issues. And that's why I think that they owe Congress and frankly, the American people an explanation. Number one, what is wrong with our models and our methodologies? Again, some of us from outside of BLS have already been able to identify that. And why has nothing been done to address it? So going forward, though, these numbers are considered by all kinds of major decision makers, market movers, whether it's the Federal Reserve, whether it's major investment houses. And the fact that they are not reliable means that people need to look for alternative sources of data. I can give you one very, very good example. For if we look at manufacturing, just as a quick case, that sector has clearly been in recession for well over a year. And we know that looking at the regional Federal Reserve banking surveys of the manufacturing sector, as well as purchasing manager indexes. And when you combine all of that data, again, it's very clear the sector has been shrinking, not growing. It's also very clear they've been losing jobs, not adding them. Sure enough, what did we see with this preliminary benchmark revision? We saw such a massive decrease in the number of manufacturing jobs that over the year in question, instead of some slow, anemic growth in terms of employment in that sector, it was a decline.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I mean, you were talking about the BLS before. You have some friends that are there. You've slammed the Labor's Department use of the birth-death model, saying it's led to massive overestimates in the job growth. We're starting to see that with the revisions. How do we fix it? What needs to be done on the policy decisions here?
Well, in terms of fixing the statistics, I think you just really need to reevaluate the models. You need to essentially look at the parameters that you're setting and see, does this reflect reality today? Not in 2019, not before the pandemic, but today. And we can look at the business formation statistics, for example, to see that that's clearly not the case, where a tremendous number of business applications are filed today, and very few of those businesses, relative to 2019, very few of those businesses actually ever get started. And even those that do get started very rarely are employing anyone besides the sole proprietor. So we're just not creating the jobs with these new businesses that we thought we would. Now, in terms of policy, one of the things that people really underestimate here is not so much the taxes on businesses, but the regulatory burden. Again, going back to manufacturing, people don't realize the manufacturing worker today, only about half of his cost to his employer is his salary and benefits. The other half is the regulatory burden. It costs $50,000 on average to hire a worker, just the regulatory burden, before you have even paid him or her a dime. And that's a big reason why our manufacturing sector today just can't compete with overseas markets. Now, that's just the manufacturing sector. Obviously, there's regulations that affect all parts of the economy, and rolling back that regulatory burden is going to be a key ingredient to helping new business formations and also to helping those successful businesses hire additional people.
Yeah, go back to that for a second. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when we look at the U.S. economy, a lot of it is propped up on small businesses, people that are actually entrepreneurial. So you're saying that is diminishing due to regs?
Absolutely. And we can see this looking at data sets that specifically analyze small businesses. So we're not talking about, the Exxon Mobils and the Walmarts of the world here. We're literally just talking about small businesses. And right now, that cohort is actually shedding jobs. We are seeing employment in that part of the economy, which is the driver of the economy. We're seeing employment there go down. So all of the net job growth today is among large corporations. Again, this is not a recipe for success. This is not a formula for long-term sustainable growth in this economy. And so much of it has to do with regulatory burdens. If you're a large corporation, for example, you can afford the attorneys that it's going to take to skirt those regulations or to get exceptions. You can afford the lobbyists that it will take to get that exception for yourself put into statute. But you can't do that if you're a small business. And by the way, Jeremy, this is a key reason why, if you look at who are the biggest proponents of these regulations, they tend to be large corporations.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it makes sense. It's so interesting because as we have guests here at Kitco, we always I get written to right after, and it's kind of like, okay, we got this Wall Street and we got Main Street, and there seems to be such a divide. I mean, has the middle class kind of been taking out? I mean, since 2021, real wages have dropped about $4,300 a year, while inflation still continues to rise. So, I mean, what are we doing with our purchasing power here?
We're destroying it. In short, Jeremy, people forget that every single dime of government spending has to be paid for. Now, you can pay for it in different ways, right? You can take it through direct taxation, like the federal income tax. You can borrow it via treasury bills, bonds, and notes, or you can take it through the hidden tax of inflation. And over the last 4 years, that has essentially been the preferred mechanism for covering all of these unfunded liabilities, these massive deficits. And the result of that has been a siphoning off of the value of all the dollars already in existence in order to create the new dollars for the government to spend. Now, you can debate whether or not you thought that that government spending was worth it, but that's just the reality of the mechanism at work. And you're absolutely right. It has destroyed the purchasing power of American families. This is why we have a cost of living crisis. This is why the monthly mortgage payment on a median price home has more than doubled in the last 3.5 years. This is why food is up 30%, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah, it's interesting, because obviously we want to give the facts, but they have these traditional recession indicators like 2 quarters of negative GDP growth hasn't been met yet. So how do you reconcile these technical benchmarks with, the financial reality that so many Americans are struggling with right now?
It's a great question. Although if we go back to the first half of 2022, we did get those 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. And somehow that was just completely whitewashed and declared to not be a recession because apparently words don't matter anymore and definitions are flexible. One thing I did think was very interesting, though, was at that time, the Treasury Secretary said, although we had that negative GDP growth, if you look at the average of GDP and GDI, it was still positive. So therefore, no recession. Of course, when that data was later revised down and the average of GDP and GDI, sometimes called gross domestic output, when that was negative for 2 consecutive quarters, suddenly the Treasury Secretary was nowhere to be found. So how on earth are we actually supposed to evaluate, to your point, Jeremy, are we in a recession? When does a recession begin? If we can't rely on these traditional indicators anymore. One of the reasons why I think we can't rely on them right now is the fact that we are pulling an unprecedented amount of growth forward from the future, something we talked about earlier. And when you do that, you are essentially hiding the underlying fundamentals in the economy today. In other words, you're hiding just how bad it is. Imagine, for example, a household where the income earner loses his or her job, and in order to continue spending, they simply open up a ton of credit cards and rack up those balances. That's what we're doing today. But you can't tell me that that's a sign of prosperity. It's a sign of impoverishment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how sustainable is the spending if it's fueled by debt rather than real income growth? I mean, what happens if credit tightens further?
It's a great question. And either credit is going to have to tighten or we're going to have to start inflating away a lot of that debt. One or the other. You can't, those are really your only 2 options at this point, Jeremy. You can't get out of this corner in which the Fed has painted us, unfortunately. Either the Fed continues holding credit tight, and really it should be tighter if we're going to kill inflation. But even if they just hold it where it is, that's unsustainable, both on the consumer end, but also on the government end, because the cost of servicing today's debt loads is already so high, and it's going higher, as you said earlier. The alternative, though, is to reduce the cost of servicing that debt by making loanable funds more available, which will require creating more money, which will mean more inflation. This is a big reason why we're seeing gold hit record highs, why we're seeing copper just on an absolute tear. It's not necessarily because the economy is red hot. But instead, I think what Dr. Copper is telling us here is the fact that inflation is not dead and it's not going away anytime soon. We forget that the Fed was sterilizing at one point $2.5 trillion of the money it created via reverse repurchase agreements. That account is down all the way to about $300 to $400 billion. That money is still working its way into the economy right now. And again, we still have another $300 or $400 billion to go. The Fed has also started taking their foot off the brake, even though they haven't lowered rates yet. They slowed QT. In other words, they're not selling off the balance sheet. They're not reducing the money supply as quickly as they were before. So they have already shifted from hawkish to dovish, in my opinion. And unfortunately, I think that gets worse with rate cuts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, has the Fed, I know have they done anything right here? I mean, we can look to other countries or at least other areas, Japan, we're hearing a lot of stagflation there, Europe. I mean, are we on the brink of that long-term stagnation or are we missing it here?
Well, if you do the same thing, expect the same results. And since you brought up Japan, Jeremy, I think, unfortunately, that's where we're headed with these debt loads that are literally a multiple of GDP. And then the only way you can possibly finance that is if you keep rates artificially low indefinitely. And the result of that will be the eventual collapse of your currency. And just like the Fed has painted us into a corner, the Bank of Japan has painted that country's economy into a corner as well, where they are now on a literally daily basis struggling to both prop up their currency, but also reduce borrowing costs to the government. And it is simply unsustainable. This happened famously in the 1920s in the United Kingdom with the Bank of England. And that was a key ingredient behind the crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed.
Yeah, EJ, I mean, you've been vocal in criticizing the economic policies of Biden and Harris's administration, particularly on inflation and real wages. I mean, November's getting really close here. What should the policies have done the most damage to the economy, and what would you change immediately?
Oh, the government spending, I think, is the thing that has done the most damage, because it was the government spending that prompted the Fed to cause the inflation to pay for that spending. And it was also that spending that exploded the debt, which meant the Fed had to keep rates much too low for much too long in order to minimize the cost of financing that debt. And when you manipulate interest rates to that extent, literally something we have never seen before in the history of the Federal Reserve, not to this extreme anyway, what that did is it caused consumers to go on an absolute borrowing spree. It caused home prices to go through the roof. And then the violent change in interest rates back to something that resembles a historical norm has completely frozen over the housing market, has caused the millions of Americans in debt to now face punishingly high interest rates, which are essentially going to keep them in debt forever. To put this in perspective, Jeremy, you now have an entire generation of Americans, the Gen Zers, who will probably, on average, never be able to afford a home. In fact, for most Gen Zers, they won't actually own a home until a relative passes away and leaves that asset to them. That's really scary, but that's where we are today. Now, the only positive thing here is the fact that so many of our economic wounds, since they are self-inflicted, if you simply remove the bad public policies that got us here, you will slowly over time reverse those effects. We've been here before, right? It took us, for example, three absolutely terrible presidents in the 1970s to eventually get us a Ronald Reagan. This really is not even a partisan issue. It's not about politics. It's about policy here. The same policies that worked very well for Ronald Reagan also worked very well for Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Again, we've been here before. We've been in this mess. We can get ourselves out of it as well.
Yeah, so you're just looking to history there. I mean, how do you respond to the claim that without this intervention, the situation could have been much worse?
Well, I have yet to see an instance where the government, when faced with one of these so-called catastrophes, failed to act, and the results somehow were a deterioration, a further deterioration of conditions. The problem is we literally haven't allowed the free market to heal itself in over 100 years. The last time we had that, where the free market was allowed to simply sort itself out, was in 1920. And the only reason that depression, it was a depression, was allowed to play itself out was essentially a fluke of history. Woodrow Wilson was president at the time, except he had suffered massive strokes and was literally incapacitated while in office. So although he wanted to act, he was physically incapable of doing so. Then we had Warren Harding become president, and he was very adamant about the free market, again, sorting itself out. His Commerce Secretary, Herbert Hoover, hounded him to no end to get him to act, to implement all kinds of public programs. Harding eventually said to Hoover, you can have a commission, you can have some studies, and then you can make recommendations to me on what course of action you think we should take. By the time that actually happened, though, the Depression had sorted itself out. And so none of those recommendations were acted on. Unfortunately, they were acted on when Hoover was president in 1930. And that was one of the reasons why the Great Depression snowballed so quickly and got as deep as it did. But again, it was essentially an accident of history, but still, it is a great example of what we should do today.
Mm-hmm. With November coming up, I mean, are you worried here, given everything we discussed, from inflation to debt to the labor market, consumer vulnerabilities? What's the most important piece of the pie right now to avoid this economic stagnation that we talked about?
I think it has to be releasing the free market, just simply unleashing prosperity. People have an incentive to earn a living. People have an incentive to serve their fellow man. People have an incentive to innovate, to create wealth, all of these things which will grow the economy and create that rising tide that lifts all boats. The problem is we have shackled this economy with confiscatory tax rates, with burdensome regulation, and the result has been the current anemia in which we find ourselves, which has essentially only been buoyed by, like we were talking about earlier, these massive and unsustainable debt loads. So we are going to need to seriously supercharge growth, Jeremy, because not only do we want to get back to those robust growth levels so that we can return to increasing our standard of living and not allowing it to decline, but on top of that, we need to also pay back a lot of the debt that we have taken on the last several years.
Yeah. So, looking at policy, I mean, we know Trump will be a little bit critical with putting some tariffs in place. Harris is talking about putting tax on unrealized gains. How do we get out of the mess?
Certainly not by taxing unrealized gains. I mean, first of all, it's not even workable. This crazy proposal would have all assets evaluated December 31st of every year. Congratulations, you just assured a complete crash in prices across all asset categories as everyone sells off at artificially low prices in order to get those values down so that they don't owe a ridiculous amount of these unrealized capital gains taxes. I mean, think of it. Imagine you're saving for retirement, and at the end of every year, you have to withdraw some of your retirement savings to pay the tax on whatever gains you may have happened to get that year. Again, unrealized. You want to kill innovation. You want to kill capital accumulation and therefore growth. This is a surefire way to do it. In terms of the tariffs, both Democrats and Republicans lately have proposed tariffs and have even enacted them. Tariffs, I think, get a really bad rap. They're attacked as being a tax on trade. Please tell me what is not a tax on trade. Do you think the income tax is not a tax on trade? You are trading your labor. What about a sales tax? A sales tax is a tax on trade. It's just a question, Jeremy, of do you want to tax domestic trade or do you want to tax international trade? If you go back and you look historically at the period in which this country experienced its greatest growth, in which we literally created the middle class, not really so much just in America, but in the entire world. It was when this country had no income tax and very, very low government spending, and it was funded almost entirely by tariffs.
Yeah. And of course, we got PCE coming out and more data to break into and see where the cracks are. EJ Antoni joining us today from Heritage Foundation. Thanks for this, EJ. I really appreciate your perspective, and hopefully we can get you on the next couple months for a little update here as we see how all of this progresses.
Thank you for having me, Jeremy. Look forward to coming back.
Appreciate it. I'm Jeremy Szafron. For all of us here at Kitco News, thank you for watching. Hit that notification button. We've got lots of great content to come, so stay tuned.